Hello, and welcome to The Future of Wine. My name is Paul Wagner, and I'm an instructor both at Napa Valley College and at the Culinary Institute of America. And I have a confession to make. I'm absolutely making this stuff up. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. And in fact, I don't have a crystal ball. So when I look into the future, I don't see interesting Nostradamus kinds of visions. I just see, frankly, trends that I think are going to continue. It always helps. I'll try to start with where we are now and then move to where we're going. And then I'll also spend a little time talking about where we should go, even if that won't happen. So the chart here is a little better idea of how I'm approaching this topic than our friend with the crystal ball. So where are we now? Good question. I'm glad I asked it. First of all, as we look at who's drinking wine, you will notice that boomers continue to be a major part of the wine drinking public, and we are slowly tapering off because, frankly, as a boomer, some of us are getting old enough that we're dying. And if we're not dying, we're certainly cutting back on the amount of wine we drink. Millennials, we hope, those of us in the wine industry hope they will continue to increase their consumption. You can see it's going up. But bear in mind that millennials tend to prefer spirits and cocktails over wine for many occasions. So I'm not sure that the wine market will ever really recover from the demographic trends we're seeing right now. But this is where we are right now, gives you an idea of what we have to work with. And then if we talk about who the American consumer is right now, notice that more than half of American consumers don't drink wine. And even amongst the people who drink wine, only 14% of them drink with high frequency. And they define high frequency as once a week or more. So it's really quite a small market. Even though there are 350 million people in America, we're really only talking about maybe 50 million people, which makes the fact that the US market is the largest wine market in the world quite remarkable. Because so many of our segments of our population don't drink wine. It's been true for a number of years now that women drink more wine than men, and that's there are a number of reasons for that, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. And again, notice by wine drinkers by generation, millennials do drink wine. 34% of millennials drink wine, 34% of boomers drink wine. Gen Xers apparently aren't so interested in wine. Don't know what happened to that generation, but they don't drink as much wine as the others. So for people in the wine industry who are looking to aim at the future, in the words of the great hockey player Wayne Gretzky, I don't go where the puck is, I try to go where the puck is going to be. Millennials are where the wine market is going to be in 20 years, so that's probably our best indication of the futures. We need to figure out where they're going and meet them wherever they get to. First year in history is 2019. Young women drank more than young men. This has been, as you can see, for generations, young men who drank more. Now it is actually women who drink more. So, and that's all alcohol. That's not just wine. That's all alcohol. So women more likely to go out and have a glass of wine with their friends than men. Men might be more inclined to go do something outdoors, perhaps, rather than an indoor party. And I find this quite interesting in terms of who buys expensive wines. Notice that boomers absolutely dominate this category. And for many people in the wine industry, this is where the money is. This is where they make their profits. And clearly, the more expensive, the more boomers get involved. Of course, this is also because boomers are in their prime earning stage of their lives. If you're in your 60s, you're probably making as much money as you've ever made in your life. And many Gen Xers and certainly millennials are still starting out on their career paths. So we would expect as these generations age, we would expect these bars to move all the way slightly to the right. But right now, it's still boomers who dominate that high bottle price. So that's where we are. Let's talk about what we care about. And I think these are sort of interesting things about who cares about issues in the community, what interests they have. Notice that boomers, for example, are relatively low in their interest of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the LGBTQ, etc. Community, whereas Gen Z and millennials are much more likely to be interested in environmental and sustainability, local community, all of these things. So quite interesting that, frankly, and perhaps not surprisingly, younger generations are more socially aware, more socially conscious than older generations. And that indicates some areas of potential for wine branding and wine marketing. Okay, 3 basic facts we're going to talk about in terms of the wine market in the US. First one is sales are increasing, but very slowly. They're basically flat. Value is up because we keep drinking more expensive wines, but we are not buying any more wine than we did 5 years ago, really. And what we're interested in are products that have value added. That means extra quality, and quality for American consumers almost always directly correlates to price, even though we in the wine industry know you don't always get what you'll pay for, and a more expensive wine is not always better than a less expensive wine. Most consumers, while they may say that, they still know that, that a $30 bottle of wine is better than a $15 bottle of wine. They're looking for character, personality, authenticity. They're looking for things that go beyond what I think of as commodity wines, nice label, nice price, nice varietal, but absolutely no element that stands out or attracts any attention or any interest. Second issue, market is flat. Second issue is it's not really one market. As a producer or as someone doing wine marketing or the business of wine, you need to understand that distributors, retailers, restaurateurs, chain buyers, consumers, all are very different audiences. Each one needs a different approach. And as a result of this, it's really quite complicated to develop a single strategy that's going to reach all of these people successfully. And that is, to me, one of the great challenges of wine marketing, but I love crossword puzzles, I love jigsaw puzzles, and that's why I love marketing, because it is a challenge. It is fun to put these pieces together to see if you can make them fit and to come up with something that really is going to be successful for, if not all of these target markets, at least the target markets you need to succeed. Again, many wine brands will decide we don't want to be in chains, or we're not going to sell to retailers, or we're not selling through distribution, we're only selling direct to consumer. That limits the challenges in terms of developing a strategy, but of course it also limits your total market. And then the third issue is the market is absolutely saturated. There are 170,000 wines in the US market. I want you to think about that. It is an absolutely astonishing number. And the challenge there is also that the distributor consolidation is overwhelming. 85 to 95% of all wine in America is distributed basically through 3 companies. Competition is overwhelming. Imagine going to the largest football stadium you've ever seen in your life, walking out into the middle of the field, looking out at the 70,000, 80,000 people in the audience, and realizing there are twice that many wines in the US market, and you are asking a consumer, someone standing out in the middle of the field looking up into the stands, you're asking a consumer to show interest in one individual fan up there. It's an overwhelming challenge, and it is overwhelming not only for the consumer, it's overwhelming for the trade, it's overwhelming for salespeople. It's a problem. And if there is one single challenge in the US wine market, is how do you make your wine stand out? How do you identify a target market, a niche market that you can own? Then you can make yours. And as consumers stand out in the middle of the field, they can look over in that one corner and say, oh, there's my wine. That's the challenge in wine marketing. So let's talk about the future and how you can possibly stand out, because I have added all of these listed all of these various elements that I think give you opportunities to stand out in the future if you do them successfully. So let's talk about each one. The first one is distribution. And of course, here is the problem. Notice that between 1995 and 2017, we went from fewer than 2,000 wineries to almost 10,000 wineries. We now have 10,000 wineries in the US. And the number of distributors dropped by more than half. So the huge problem there is how, as a winery, you even get the attention of distributors. And frankly, unless you are making wines that are quite literally getting 100 points, 95 points won't do it. It's not high enough. There are too many 95-point wines in the market these days. Or unless you have a truly unique selling proposition, a true USP, what you're offering most distributors is for them to expand their portfolio and cannibalize sales for your brand from other brands they already have. There's no money in it for them, and they're not interested. So how do you stand out? Well, one way to stand out with distribution is to be the biggest. So Gallo, they won't have any problem with the consolidation of distributors, nor will Constellation. These big companies have enough leverage in the marketplace. When they talk, the distributor listens. But if you're not one of those biggest and best companies, you have some real challenges. You do need to create demand or you will die. So you need to build demand in the marketplace, and then you need to chase your product through the pipeline to make sure it is moving at every level. It's a ton of work. It is certainly more work than growing grapes, and it's certainly more work than making wine. So if you think, for example, that once you make a good wine, your job is half over, I'm going to say you're absolutely crazy. Growing great grapes and making great wines is about a quarter the job of building a successful brand in the American market. The rest of it is marketing and sales, and it is something that demands way more time than the other two. So create that demand or you will die. Certainly, you can connect up with some niche distributors who will serve specific markets, whether they're restaurants or fine restaurants, or for that matter, airlines or some of these other outlets. But difficult to build a brand only on those levels. There are a few examples that have been very successful, very hard work, because the large distributors will always win. As you get successful, as you begin to grow, those big distributors will come to you and say, gee, you really ought to be with us. And then, of course, the challenge is you lose most of your leverage. If you are with a smaller distributor, you have more leverage. Larger distributor gives you much better distribution, but quickly you're a small fish in a very big pond, a big challenge. So as you move forward in the future, as you look at how you're going to play in this constantly changing set of rules and regulations of how the wine business works, you need to determine now a strategy that will not only work today, but you should be thinking what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how is your distribution plan going to allow you to succeed with this increasing consolidation and this increasing focus on, or I'm going to say bifurcation between nationally distributed brands and those that really only sell at the winery. And you need to make that decision early on, and then you need to go all in. And this, for example, in 2018, you want to sell wine. If you want to sell a lot of wine, you need to be off-premise. Off-premise Again, just to be clear, off premises when the wine is consumed off the premises, so that's retail shops, on premise, restaurants, hotels. That DTC number is going to increase. And it's not going to increase because Gallo and Constellation are going to invest a lot of time and money into DTC. It's because they are going to dominate the consolidation of distributors so completely that smaller wineries are going to realize their only real sales option is to sell direct to consumer. So that DTC, while it is a very small part of the market, and you can see here it's only about what 15%, maybe less. Sorry, 2%, maybe less. The other half of that is that they will the revenue from DTC is far higher than the volume. So DTC is always more profitable, and as a small winery, it's a clear focus. And that will continue to increase in the future. I'm basing that both on my own intuition, but I'm also basing that on trends that you see across the market. So many small wineries starting up, and all of them are focusing on DTC. So now that we've talked about channels just a little bit, let's move on. Let's talk about an innovation in products. And if you'd asked me 20 years ago, is there room for new products in the marketplace? Most people would have answered in terms of varietals. Most people would have said, oh, I think there's potential for Albarino, or I think there's potential for Grenache. And it really would have been a focus on varietal wines. On another level, you might have heard people saying there's a potential for certain regions to grow. 25 years ago, New Zealand was relatively unknown. Now it's a major player in the world market. So you can expect new regions to emerge. With every new region, you realize that the market is more saturated. So it used to be in the good old days of 100 years ago when you lived when you were an upper class Englishman, you drank Burgundy, Bordeaux, German Riesling, you drank port, sherry, and an occasional bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape. I left out champagne. Those were the only categories. Today, there are endless categories, and whether you walk into a retail shop or look on a restaurant wine list, suddenly the categories are just increasing. These categories generally by varietal or by region. Those will continue to develop. But now we're looking at new categories. Low alcohol wines has been a category for some time. It will continue to grow. Notice that the increasing number of stories about the impact of consuming alcohol. The World Health Organization has now said that if you do not drink alcohol, there is absolutely no reason for you to start because it is not good for your health. That's going to have an impact in the future. But we're also talking about now wines and how they are made. And and we'll get into this later, the biodynamic and the organic and the sustainable, but we're talking about orange wines and amphora wines. These are ancient technologies that are now being used today to make wine. Something I would not have expected had I not seen it with my own eyes, but wines that are now aged in bourbon barrels or tequila barrels to give them an additional character. So I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of people in the wine industry who are experimenting with new products. I think it's fun. I think it creates all sorts of new opportunities. I would even look at vermouth, which is simply red wine that has had herbs added and spices added to it, as a new potential for craft beverages, the same way that people are making beers flavored with all sorts of different things. I don't think there's any reason why we won't see small craft production wineries making special herb wines like vermouth. And certainly in Northern Europe, they sell mulled wine during the holidays, similar kind of product. So all of those sorts of innovations in products or bringing back products that may have been historically produced 1,000 years ago, I think those are all possibilities. Again, The key element here is which one of these is actually going to give you the opportunity to stand out from the crowd and say, here's what we do that's different. And if you can attract a group of consumers and make something different, then you have that niche market that you're looking for that's going to be so important in the future, because otherwise you're just going to be one of 170,000 people in the stadium and nobody's going to notice you, even if you're yelling, because everybody else is yelling as well. Another way to stand out is obviously with your brand image. And one of the ways I like to teach this is very simple. Is that when you reach my age and you decide it is time you're going to sell this winery because your children have seen how hard you work and they don't want to buy it. So you put the winery up for sale and you find someone who's got plenty of money to buy it. And he comes to you and he says, I want everything. I want the vineyards. I want the wine in barrel. I want the wine in bottle, the equipment, the winery, the tasting room. I want everything. There's only one thing I don't want to buy. And that's the name, because I want to put my name on this winery. Why else would anybody buy a winery if they didn't want to put their name on it? So you sell him the winery and you're left with your name, the brand name of the winery. The amount of money you're paid for that brand name is absolutely the perfect way to measure how successful your marketing has been. And if you sell that for $17,000 to Fred Franzia, which is what Charles Shaw did with the Charles Shaw brand, you did a really crummy job of marketing. Charles Shaw is, of course, the official name for Two Buck Chuck, a brand name that would now be worth millions and millions of dollars. But in those days, he had done a very bad job of marketing, and Fred Franzia bought it for $17,000. On the other hand, you can look at some wineries recently that have sold, and they don't have vineyards. They don't have a winery. They have no capital assets other than their brand name, and yet they sold for over $300 million. And that's because Meiomi and The Prisoner did a spectacular job of building demand and creating a relationship with their customers. So as I think about where the wine industry is going in the future, I think many wineries are finally beginning to get the message that the most valuable asset they own is not a vineyard, it's not a winery, but it is that list of customers that is anxiously awaiting every new release of your wine. And if you develop a customer base that is sizable, and in the case of Meiomi and The Prisoner, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who are willing to pay $30 and above for wine, and they love your brand, you have an extremely marketable brand, and you'll get paid a lot of money for it. Now, this really only matters if you're interested in becoming a nationally distributed brand. If you're only interested in selling wine direct to consumer, the process is a little smaller and a little more direct. And then we need to talk about how you build not your brand, but your destination, so that people come to your winery because they love the destination. You'll note that I'm not talking about the quality of the wine. People don't go to wineries specifically for the quality of the wine. Most consumers go to a winery because of how they're treated, because of the experience of visiting the winery. And again, I can say this partly because there are very few wineries in the world today that are making bad wine. So if you make good wine, you're just like everybody else, unless you can distinguish yourself in some way. And if you're doing DTC, direct to consumer, that means the interaction with the consumer, the reception at the winery, the experience at the winery has to be what sets you apart. And if you're in distribution, it has to be that sense from the consumer that they're making some kind of human connection with the people in this brand, whether it's Meiomi is my wine, or whether it's The Prisoner in that sense of someone who is daring and interesting and has a story to tell. Those are the kinds of interaction and engagement that you want with your customer. A pretty picture of a chateau and a name that says we make very good wine, that's not going to get you that kind of engagement from the customer. And of course, whichever way you do this, whether it is at the winery as a destination or whether it is through distribution, the key to this is you need to develop relationships in a way that's scalable. You need to be able to build and increase, because if all of your marketing depends upon you personally talking to every consumer, there comes a point where you can't talk to any more consumers. And at that point, you've maxed out that particular strategy. You need to come up with strategies that can expand beyond your existing resources. Because ultimately, one way or the other, the only way you're really going to know if your marketing works is when you sell it, you discover that people are really willing to pay for it. And for every winery that has vineyards and wineries and didn't sell for $300 million, I always point to Meiomi and The Prisoner and say, no vineyards, no winery. The only thing they had to sell was a brand name, a label, and they sold it for over $300 million. That is great marketing. So now we have another way of standing out. Let's talk about packaging. Bag-in-the-box is old news, but there are some people who are making very good wines in bag-in-the-box. They seem to control that category. That category doesn't seem to be growing beyond a few brands. But given the interest in recyclable materials and protecting our poor and suffering earth, maybe bag-in-the-box is something that will grow in the future. Screw cap. I am fascinated by the fact that in Australia and New Zealand, 90% of the wine that is sold is in screw cap, and in the United States, 90+% of the wine is not in screw cap. Two different audiences. Somehow you have to assume that I doubt that the Australians and the Kiwis are going to change. I wonder if the US market is going to move towards screw caps at some point. It won't happen with my generation of boomers, but it may very well happen with millennials who may view screw caps in a different light. Certainly one of the issues for many sommeliers these days is the number of expensive wines that come in these very heavy bottles. They make absolutely no sense in terms of the carbon footprint. They're unpleasant to deal with in table service. And so I wonder if we're not going to see wineries moving to lighter bottles. I was recently on a cruise ship speaking about wine, and one of the wineries that they were pouring on their reserve list, I picked up the bottle after it was empty, and I thought, gosh, this is a very light bottle. And I handed it to one of the winemakers on the cruise with me, and he tapped it with his finger and he said, this is a plastic bottle. So it was good enough that while the wine was served, we were under the impression it was a glass bottle, but it was in fact a plastic bottle, much lighter, much better for the environment. So that's a trend. Again, if you're looking at marketing issues and ways to take a stand and stand out from the crowd, all of these might be ways that you can get a jump on the market to do what Wayne Gretzky says and get there before everybody else and be a leader rather than a follower. Followers make commodities and leaders lead categories and make brands. Cans. Sofia Coppola, of course, has her bubbly in a can, and even comes with a little straw. And the reason for the straw is, of course, that young women drinking this in a bar prefer to drink something that won't mess up their lipstick. So she inserted a little straw. That's a unique approach. The product has been successful. It's not a product for everyone. It's not a product that is going to push champagne off the world map, but it is a product that has a developed, committed niche market. It has loyal fans. That's a successful product launch. And so as you look at building projects, as you look at developing strategies for the future, that's the question you have to ask. How can you offer something that stands out? How can you offer something that's a little different than anybody else? Got to make sure that even while it is different, it is attractive to consumers. There are also ways that you can do this simply by talking to special audiences. And this can be as simple as a national brand that does this effectively is Subaru has become a sponsor of the national parks. And that affiliation then implies some characteristics to Subaru, and it also generates an affiliation there that's positive for both of them. Wineries can do the same thing. Wineries can become major sponsors of a local wilderness area. They can create a program that for every bottle that is sold, they'll plant a tree somewhere. For some reason, given the status of the earth, I'm looking at ways to protect things these days. But there are all sorts of things. We've done, my own company did projects with high-end sparkling wine from Italy, Franciacorta, for example, and we picked out high-end showrooms in New York City, Ferrari, Prada, Dolce Gabbana, etc. And then we held special receptions where those companies invited their best customers to drink our bubbly, and we invited our best customers to drink our bubbly in the showrooms of Prada and Ferrari. And there was a borrowed interest and a shared success. It was pretty successful promotion. So these sorts of things are absolutely an option. And if you can develop them into long-term plans and strategies, they can really help your brand. And I think we're going to see more of this. There's a reason that LVMH is investing so much in wine. There is an absolute relationship in the luxury market that can pay real benefits, real dividends. I love the idea of owning a target market that nobody else can take away from you. I've always said that if I started a winery, I would probably call it Smith, because then every time a member of the Smith family anywhere in America held a family reunion, I could provide their house wine and I'd sell thousands of cases without ever having to think about anything. That's an example of a target market. What target market can you own that nobody can steal from you? Because if you base your unique selling proposition on the fact that you have a blue bottle, well, trust me, sooner or later, someone like Gallo is going to look at that and say, we can come up with a better blue bottle. It'll be more attractive. It'll sell for a little less money. And we have massive leverage with the distributorship. So we're going to go in and just blow them out of the water. So the fact that your point of differentiation has something to do with how you make the wine or package the wine, always a danger. Whereas if your unique selling proposition has to do with your human connection with your target market, that person to person, it's much more difficult for another company to come in and steal that. And in fact, it's something that large companies do very badly. This is the advantage small companies, small wineries have in any market. They can talk person to person and human to human. Large companies find that difficult. And of course, as I've said previously in this lecture and other lectures, quality is a given. Don't talk about quality because everybody's got quality. You need to go beyond the fact that you make good wine because everybody does. And as we started tonight looking into our crystal ball, trends will change. Who knows, that screw cap trend where it started for a little bit in the US and then kind of petered out, we may find in 10 years that screw caps are hugely important. So you will have to be prepared to adapt and take advantage of whatever happens in the marketplace. The sooner you do it, the quicker you do it, the more likely you are to become a leader, the less likely you are to be one of those thousands of passengers in the back end of the train, simply passengers on the bus making a commodity. And in every region, what you're going to see is that direct-to-consumer will be, for almost every winery under, let's say, 20,000 cases, a hugely important part of their ongoing business plan. And the more effectively you can execute a DTC program, the more successful you will be. Here's a trend that is quite clearly happening, and it offers both opportunities and challenges. Some companies are taking a real leadership role in this. In Porto, the Taylor Port House is hosting an annual conference on the climate. Speaker the first year was Barack Obama, so it's a fairly high visibility conference they're doing, and they're absolutely dedicating themselves to this issue. Miguel Torres, the largest family-owned winery in Spain, has made huge investments in this area, and in fact they're literally moving their vineyards further up the mountains in Catalonia to adjust for the fact that the climate is changing. So again, if you're going to the future, then you need to get ahead of this curve rather than just follow it. And we now have wineries that are 100% organic, that are carbon neutral, that are biodynamic, that are sustainable. Natural, by the way, doesn't mean anything, so it's quite a wonderful word to slap on any food product. But all of those terms are beginning to be used. The challenge for most people is that the consumers don't really understand the difference between sustainable, biodynamic, carbon neutral, and organic. They think they're all just natural. And most consumers just think wine in general is a pretty natural product. One area I think that there's enormous opportunity for improvement in the world of wine is the use of water. And the people that I would hold up as examples for this are the Australians, who are working in a much drier climate. And they are now working with levels that allow them to produce a gallon of wine by using less than 2 gallons of water. And if you think that doesn't sound good, the average in the rest of the world is it takes 7 to 10 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of wine. So imagine the water savings. And again, with climate change, water is going to become even more critical. If the entire world of wine went from using 9 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of wine down to 2 gallons. So these are the sorts of things that I think there's an opportunity for a story to be told. I think there's an opportunity for a brand to be established and relationships to be built with consumers that would last you a long time into the future if you were successful at executing them. So let's talk about our friends, the consumers. I love this photograph, this poor woman looking at a wall of wine, absolutely no idea what to buy, has a general price point in mind, and is just completely overwhelmed by what it is she's looking at. What can we do about this? Well, I think we need to learn how to talk to consumers. In the wine industry, we've always begged for a way to make wine less intimidating. We always talk about how, oh, wouldn't it be nice if wine were more approachable? Yeah, well, yes, it is, but then we do everything wrong. And I won't go into all the things we do wrong, but I would just suggest if you want to know what we do wrong, the first thing you should do is go on any winery website and express an interest in a specific wine and click on that wine in the website, because what you will get is the technical data sheet on the wine. And trust me, no consumer wants the technical data sheet on the wine, and yet that's what the winery gives them. And this has been going on for 75 years. It's certainly been going on since I've been in the wine industry, which is 35, 40 years. So it would appear that the wine industry is incapable of learning, but it does give you an opportunity as you join the wine industry, as you add your input into the way the wine industry does business, you have the opportunity to change the way the wine industry does things. And the most basic element you need to introduce in everything moving to the future is to establish a human connection between the customer and the brand. And if you'll indulge me, I have a few slides that will explain how that might be done. So first of all, this is how you shouldn't talk to consumers. Do not talk about DOCGs, Denominazione di Origine Controllata e Garantita, or limited yields, or viticultural practices, or malolactic fermentation. Consumers don't care about this stuff. Winemakers love to talk about these things, but winemakers don't buy wine. In fact, when winemakers want wine, they always offer to trade for it. Consumers do not care about any of this stuff. Please don't teach chemistry. Wine is the most romantic beverage in the world, and it has nothing to do with pH or titratable acidity. And yet we consistently talk about this with our consumers. It's not only a waste of our time, it's a waste of their time. And consumers are sensitive to that. Don't give them geology lessons. No one has ever walked into a wine shop and said, "Do you have any bottles from calcareous soils?" That's not the way consumers think about wine. We spend endless hours teaching our students about this. We spend endless hours talking about this to each other and to consumers. And it always reminds me of the Peanuts Christmas specials, where the kids, when they talk, they all talk to each other. But when an adult talks, if you remember, all the children hear is wah, 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 wah. And when we talk about geology or malolactic fermentation, just put yourself in the shoes of the consumer, in the ears of the consumer, and have them sit there listening to you going wah, 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 wah. And you have to ask yourself, what is it I'm doing here that in any way enables us to make a connection with this person in front of me? They don't want botany lessons. And where do we come up with these names? I mean, if you want to sell something, don't call it 1103 Paulson. Call it something romantic. But no, we want to tell people about the clone 667 that is so wonderful. I'm sorry, consumers don't care about clone 667. They want to talk dreams. They want to talk the luxury of lifestyle. They want to talk about experience. And the experience we're giving them is the experience they studied in high school biology. Trust me, nobody wants to go to their high school biology class on vacation. And of course, we teach enology. Nobody cares. First of all, we lie about everything. We tell people that this wine spent 12 months in French oak barrels, but in fact, some of it spent 12 months in French oak barrels, and some of it, about 30%, spent a little less time in some less powerful oak because we didn't want to over oak it too much. And we put 10% in a stainless steel tank in case we did over oak it. We could back blend it back to get a little freshness in the flavor. And then when it came time to bottling, that we just added maybe 2% Petit Verdot because that gives it that little extra oomph in the finish. And then we tell people, yeah, it was aged for 12 months in French oak barrels. Well, it wasn't. We're lying. That's a terrible, terrible precedent to set with your consumers, and nobody cares anyway. So why do we talk about this stuff? If you think wine is the most romantic beverage in the world, and if you think that romance has to do with cold soaks and indigenous yeasts, you are a very strange individual. We need to stop talking about all this stuff and start talking about stuff that really matters to the consumer. So what do consumers want? They want to fall in love with your wine. And they can't do that because 30% of it went through malolactic fermentation. No one has ever fallen in love with a malolactic fermentation. They have fallen in love with a story. They have fallen in love with a person. When they open a bottle of wine, they are not consuming a beverage. A bottle of wine is a ticket to a new destination. And when they pull that cork, they're getting on the train to a whole new world, and you want that world to be a wonderful and interesting place. You do not want it to be their high school chemistry classroom. So, with only 35% of Americans having passports, they don't have to travel because they know a nice little Italian restaurant in their town. They don't have to go to Italy. They don't have to go to France. They saw the movie French Kiss. And they don't have to travel to Patagonia or Argentina. They can walk into their liquor store and buy a bottle of Malbec. So they're traveling not on planes, trains, and automobiles. They're traveling through restaurants, movies, and their dinner table. And we need to make those voyages pleasant, fun, interesting, and different. We need to give them experiences, not data. So I love this slide. It's a very nice story. Um, when I teach this live, I ask if anybody knows who she is, and of course, nobody ever does. Occasionally, someone suggests that she might be a swimmer from Cal. Well, that's very clever. But in fact, her name is Natalie Coughlin. She, until recently, had won more Olympic swimming medals than any other person in history, something like that. But that's not what we talk about when we're in the world of wine, because in the world of wine, here's how we describe Natalie Coughlin. Now, I'm sorry, this is true. This information is true, but it doesn't tell you what you want to know. What you want to know is what makes her smile. You want to know what kind of person is she? By the way, she is interested in wine. She has a small winery project up in Napa, and she spends some of her free time teaching underserved kids how to swim because she thinks that nobody should be afraid of the water. That's what you want to know about Natalie Coughlin. What movies does she like? You do not want to know that she's 1.1% phosphorus, although I have had an Italian winemaker argue with me quite seriously that 0.9% of trace elements is what makes each one of us different, and that's where the really interesting stuff is. He's a sad man, and he's a symbol for a sad industry that doesn't understand what we really need to be doing when we talk about wine. Wine is not about facts. People don't remember facts. They remember stories. My father was a history teacher, and he always used to say that in a 1 hour lecture, he could only give his students one date, because if he gave them two, they'd still only remember one. So his rule was you only got one date per lecture in the hopes that they might remember it. Then in the world of wine, we give them hundreds of data points and somehow expect them to be interested, let alone remember them. They're not interested and they don't remember them. And so what they hear is wah, 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 wah. In the future, what we need to do is help our consumers fall in love with wine. And that means telling stories, making a human connection, giving them personality, authenticity, and it means creating an image around your brand that has nothing to do with how you make the wine and has everything to do with why